Welcome to the Brain Network podcast. We're going to talk about eating disorders today, and I'm with Jade Wright, resident Bogan, and person with lived experience of eating disorders, and Megan Bray, a dietitian who has a non-diet approach, director of the Collective Health Co, and a PhD candidate researching eating disorders, and also has lived experience of eating disorders. So I want to start, I'll ask you, Megan, what is a dietitian? What do they do? And what's the non-diet approach?
Yeah. So I guess what a dietitian does is we use food and nutrition science to help people improve their health and well-being. So at university, we spend a lot of time studying physiology and biochemistry, a bit of anatomy. And ultimately, it's just about how we can apply the current science of nutrition to help people feel better. And yeah, I'm what's called a non-diet dietitian. So a lot of the time, dietitians are known, I guess, for being the food police or someone that's going to tell you what not to eat. Dietitians tend to come to mind when someone's thinking about weight loss. But what a non-diet dietitian is someone who, I guess, views health through a more holistic lens. We don't focus on weight loss as a primary measure of improving health. We would be more inclined to focus on diet quality or someone's relationship with food. So I sort of think of it as like an additive approach rather than a restrictive approach, which I guess, given I'm interested in eating disorders too, I think ties well into that.
And I imagine that you're coming up against a lot of social and cultural influence and stereotypes about dieting and health and food and social media and traditional media's sort of influence on what we should be eating and how we should be trying to lose weight and do all this sort of stuff. So is that something that you have to constantly battle against, or is there a way to use media to your advantage? Is there how do you address all that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, like, we live in a massive diet culture. I think most of us from kids will be learning about quote unquote good foods and bad foods. And, all we have to do is go out to a restaurant and you're probably going to be sitting there and have someone say, oh, I'm so naughty for eating this. I'm so bad. I'll have to go to the gym. Like, it's this conversation that we hear everywhere. I think the thing that I come back to is that from a statistical perspective, diets actually don't work. So something like 95% of people who diet end up kind of returning to sort of their previous eating behaviors, or even kind of having a worse relationship with food. And ironically, dieting is actually associated with like weight gain over time, not weight loss. So I think as much as I am up against it, dietitians are up against it, when you talk with most people about their experiences of food and dieting, most people can tell you an experience of when they cut out a certain food group or went on a certain diet and they did it for a short period, but then, they realized it wasn't that fun or it wasn't very sustainable. So I actually find that most people will have an individual experience of diet culture being pretty sucky, and kind of using that as a leverage point to kind of say, well, you could keep doing this. However, like, would you be interested in learning a different way of improving your health or, your relationship with food, or whatever their specific goals might be?
Yeah. And you've had a lived experience of an eating disorder that's sort of infused your understanding of what people who are seeking a dietitian need and how to approach your practice. So can you talk about your lived experience?
Yeah, for sure. So Yeah, it's interesting. I actually started off in an economics degree because I was dead set on definitely not being a dietitian. And if I was going to be a dietitian, I definitely wasn't going to work in eating disorders. So I've absolutely not done anything I said that I would. But I had a lived eating disorder experience across, all of high school and into my early 20s. I know. So we talk about eating disorders as being something called biopsychosocial. So they have biological roots. When you look through my family history, there are so many people with eating disorders. When you think about the psychological traits, people are often quite perfectionistic or people pleasing and anxious. And I look back and I was totally that kid. And, some of the social factors as well. So I had some, I guess, tumultuous life stuff happen at that critical juncture of being a teenager. And it just kicked off. And it's interesting, like, I don't usually talk through a specific diagnosis. And I guess the reason for that is I didn't really ever get proper treatment. I managed to bumble around and not sort of maybe access what I would see now as the right care. But also across the course of my eating disorder, I would have spanned all of the diagnoses and all of the behaviors, but the reality is no matter what I looked like or no matter what I was doing, I always felt the same on the inside. So there was I had a lot of issues with sort of self-worth and, figuring out who I was in the world.
Yeah.
Which is hard enough when you're a teenager, let alone when all this stuff's happening.
Absolutely.
And Jade, I saw you nodding there a lot.
Emphatically, yes.
Yeah. So would you say that you have a similar experience, or does it differ in some way? How would you characterize your lived experience?
I'd say my lived experience was probably quite acute in comparison and short-lived, but everything else I absolutely agree with 100%. Tumultuous, trying to control the things I couldn't control, very perfectionistic, just black and white all the way, all or nothing thinking. So yeah, absolutely agree.
So I can, as a person that doesn't have that experience of an eating disorder, I can relate to not having a sense of control over things and having anxiety and being a perfectionist and a people pleaser and not fitting in and all this sort of stuff. And for me, that manifested in different ways. For example, one of the things was I went through a phase of being suicidal. So that was a thing that I had control over. And so I think the way I'm sort of, from what I'm hearing, is that you've got all these factors and there's family history as well. And you don't have control over what's going on, and there's that sense of loss, but you do have control over what you can eat, and that becomes maladaptive, and turns into an eating disorder. So is that on the mark, or is there something that I've missed?
No, that's a very, very accurate depiction. I think, sometimes I think if it wasn't the eating disorder, it could have been something else. So, you mentioned suicidality, like, I think substance use disorders, self-harm, like, I think a lot of the time when there's big feelings or we feel that we can't control the things that are happening in our lives, we turn to those things because even though they're maybe not great in the long term, in the immediate term, we don't maybe see another alternative. Yeah.
And
I always say that the real problem with heroin is that it works,
Until it doesn't.
Until it doesn't.
Until it doesn't. Yes, it very much doesn't. Until it very much doesn't.
So eating disorders are a big part of the corpus callosum disorder community and the neurodiversity community and lots of different communities in the disability sector. There seems to be a bit of, I don't know if there's a predilection with things like autism and ADHD and all these different diagnoses of neurodiversity for these people to be more likely to develop an eating disorder, but it makes sense to me in my own mind where there's a predilection to anxiety, and that's partly a physiological thing, and it's also partly fitting into a society that's not made for them as being neurodiverse people. So I want to touch on that specifically for our community. How does treating an eating disorder, or how does it work? First of all, like Jade has had an acute experience, and Megan, you've had a longer term thing, and I think I don't know, but I think eating disorders are more likely to be a long-term journey, generally speaking. But I guess so. How do we? What's the best way to treat it? And then how would it differ for somebody who's neurodiverse, who has autism or something like that? Is there a different treatment modality for them that works better? Is there issues that that we need to address for those people specifically?
Would you like me to go first on that one?
Yeah, sure.
Yep. Because I was going to say, I think actually people with lived experience have, a lot more to say on this topic.
Okay.
But, one thing I would say is that our current evidence-based treatment models, so mostly at the moment, if you present with an eating disorder, they're going to recommend that you work with a mental health professional and hopefully receive one of our leading evidence-based treatment models. The thing is that they're not really adapted for, or have consideration of the fact that there's lots of people who will present with autism or ADHD as well as their eating disorder. I was doing my research for this, and I was looking at a systematic review that said in all of their samples, there was 23% of people who would have also met a diagnosis for autism as well as their eating disorder. And so I think that can be really tricky because a lot of the evidence-based models, they're manualized. So they have like phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and they're pretty rigid and structured. The other thing that I would probably say on that too is our definition of recovery, I don't think takes into account neurodiversity, and perhaps I'm thinking here as an example, say someone who has a preference for similar textures or similar flavors, or something that had been there before the onset of their eating disorder in terms of their relationship with food. They will often be pushed to overcome that and sort of told it's from the eating disorder.
Right.
So I don't think we actually do a great job of differentiating what comes from where.
Yeah. And how do you feel about that, Jay? Do you feel like what was your experience getting treated and getting your needs met?
I had a very similar experience to Megan in that there was a lot going on. Like my poor therapist, oh my goodness, she had a lot to deal with, a lot to dig through, and I think trying to distinguish that can sometimes be a little unhelpful, but also quite necessary in understanding what's going on. And I think sensory things like Megan was saying, the textures of certain foods wasn't really addressed much at all, and I think I would have benefited quite a lot if that had been on the card. But I think too, a lot of the broader strokes things of like not moralizing which foods are good and bad, and
yes,
sort of getting your nutrition where it comes from basically was quite helpful. So I think it works mostly so far. Could do with some refining, but so far it works quite well.
And I can't help but wonder if there's some sort of intersection with the challenges of treating this condition that mostly affects women, and then autism and treating autism in women and girls is also has challenges is underdiagnosis and lack of recognition of neurodiversity in girls and women. So I feel like there's probably a lot of aiming at the wrong targets in terms of addressing the different issues that come with eating disorders and things that might come from autism, like the texture thing. So how can we address someone with an eating disorder that has preference for textures? Is there a particular approach that we can take, or
there are increasingly adaptations. So there is a lot of overlap between autism and anorexia nervosa, but we also see it a lot in something called ARFID, or avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, which is kind of a newer eating disorder diagnosis that doesn't rely on the kind of body image disturbance criteria that you see in the other eating disorders. It is really sort of textural, and there's really strong aversions to food. And I think actually like a good cohort of people to learn from is dietitians who've been working with individuals living with autism without eating disorders. Like if anything, we need to go back to that and, take what we know there and then pull it across to the eating disorder space. I think the other thing that sort of complicates this is in the context of eating disorders, there's something called starvation syndrome. So when someone eats below the energy that their body needs, they will enter this state called starvation syndrome. And they did this study on sort of previously healthy men that had never had eating disorder symptoms. And after 6 months of semi-starvation, they all presented as very rigid, very obsessive, like having really strong fixations on food. So I think another problem here too is that a lot of the time people will struggle to sort of figure out which of these things come from starvation syndrome and which of these things were actually always there or perhaps are associated with an undiagnosed condition, like if they haven't ever received the diagnosis of autism or ADHD or whatever it might be.
So it sounds like it can be like a bit of a downward spiral, like getting into starvation syndrome, and that creates more of an issue that may.
Yeah, definitely. So I think in my work, it's often like if you can get someone adequate nutrition, even if it is through a narrower range of food, and then some of these things are persisting, and you'll probably start to see other things, other traits, other parts pop up as well that might indicate, hey, we probably need to get this person into someone who specializes in not just eating disorders to ensure that they are maybe getting screened for other things as well. But I also think like us as clinicians, we need to be upskilling in this. And I think it is like heartwarming in a sense that particularly in the last 12 to 18 months, I've noticed most of the leading eating disorder sort of training bodies have been talking about this topic, which is cool.
Yeah, okay.
It's cool.
That's excellent to hear that there's that move to address that issue. So I guess to sort of bring it home, I want to ask you both, but I'll start with Jade. What were the key things that you learned in your experience that you can sort of impart on somebody that might be going through the same thing, that you can sort of speak to in what worked for you?
That's tricky.
Always about the tricky questions, eh?
Yeah, well, I think I was clutching very, very tightly to one ideal, one series of ideas, and the idea of letting go was so terrifying because I thought there was nothing else. I honestly couldn't see a world in which I could eat normally and also normally, quote unquote, eat normally and function the way I wanted to and be successful if that was so important. And I think so being brave enough to even flirt with that a little bit is probably my biggest piece of advice, is to just try, suck it and see, essentially.
So is it about like your whoever's addressing your treatment, they had to really or maybe didn't effectively at the start address that issue of worldview and the way that you needed to see things in order to get to where you needed to be? Or is it more of that, like addressing that core issue of like you've got this control over this thing and you lose that, then you've got nothing?
I think I was unwilling, I think there was parts of me that didn't want to accept the things that were coming up, because there was a lot of queer stuff coming in, which is, again, if we're taking a holistic view of eating disorders, trans people often have quite a high prevalence of eating disorders. What was I saying? Anyway, yeah, there was just so much to dig through that it felt so overwhelming at the very start. Like I can see myself at the very beginning of this journey, just so reluctant to eat that custard because I knew where it was heading, and it wasn't a pretty picture, but the recovery was never a straight road. But I do think it was worth it. I honestly, truly do not think I could be here or would be here if it hadn't been for a few key people that had come in at just the right time, honestly.
Yeah. Awesome. That's just a great testimony to the people that were there for you to help you in that moment that you needed them. So I want to ask you, Megan, if that resonates with you, or if your journey was a bit different. What was the key sort of thing that you can take from your experience to talk to other people about it and say, what was the most useful things that helped you?
Yeah, my experience, it's super interesting. Like, it sounds like there were different aspects to mine and your journey, Jade, but there's also like profound similarities. And I find that the case with lots of people with eating disorders. I probably wouldn't recommend that someone take the trajectory I took to recovery, purely because I truly believe that had I accessed more kind of targeted specialist treatment early, I wouldn't have had to take so long to get through it.
Okay. Yeah.
So I really do think accessing kind of a specialist team who knows what they're on about, but not someone who's necessarily bound to giving a certain model. So maybe a team that you can trust, where they kind of respect you enough to like bounce ideas off as well. So if you were saying like, hey, I think there's this other problem for me as well, that they listened to that. Rather than just saying, no, this is the only way for how you get better from an eating disorder. I think the other thing that was super duper important to me definitely was like creating a future that I cared about, or that I like, we talk about like creating a life worth living. And I know for me, like going to uni or keeping friends or like traveling, like just trying to keep things in my life that made me want to stay earthside was very, very important. And like for me, I think about this personal growth thing as probably a forever thing. Like I anticipate that I'll go back to like that I'll be in therapy on and off probably forever, because that's just the kind of person that I am. So I think there's also, if you can just be like willing to accept that it takes time and things can get better reasonably quickly, but to do all of the work, you're probably going to be doing it for, a decent amount of years. And I think, I've gone through layers and layers of treatment, and being open to that, I think, was helpful.
Yeah. I think that that resonates with me, that being open to having to do quite a bit of different things that are going to be long-term thinking. And that went against what I thought
Totally.
It's really not a sexy idea. It's
Yeah,
there's like
yeah,
no magic
yeah.
bullet, which is just such a cliche, but it's so true.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like, are you kidding me? I'm still here.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, so what prevented you from taking the optimal route? You talked about how there was a bit of time at the start where you didn't sort of get to the targeted treatment.
Oh, yeah. We can enter the big topic of fat phobia if you'd like as well.
Let's do it.
So I guess like I started at a quote unquote higher weight, like I wasn't in necessarily a smaller body when my eating disorder kicked off. So I think the reality is I was permitted to lose a lot of weight for quite a reasonable amount of time before someone was like, oh, maybe this isn't just a quote unquote health kick. So I think that was probably one thing, is the systemic fat phobia that people face.
Yes.
Which is a real problem for lots of people, and lots of people never end up. There's only 6% of people with eating disorders who are quote unquote underweight. So actually the majority of people with eating disorders will never be quote unquote underweight. Yes.
So 94% are not underweight. So
yep.
Are they like
across the weight spectrum?
Okay.
So they might be kind of like so BMI 20 or above kind of thing, like, you know, the full spectrum. So yes, it's actually very rare that someone be underweight.
There was a TV show on Netflix that had like all these skinny people. I can't remember.
To the bone, probably. I don't know if I can mention names. But yeah, it's a real problem. Like, it's a real stereotype we have, and it gets in the way of people accessing timely care.
Yeah, that show is everything I know about eating disorders.
Yeah.
Except for now.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
You're
welcome.
So is it possible that like people across the weight spectrum, that there's people that don't know that they have eating disorders because they don't fit the image? Is that a thing?
Yeah, I think a lot of people just sort of feel that they don't have self-control, and they wouldn't, quote unquote, self-control, willpower, you know, like
or like you were saying, Megan, with your family history, like my mum did this, it's normal.
Yes, absolutely. So I think it's something like 30% of people who present to weight loss clinics would actually meet criteria for binge eating disorder. So it's also too, like, I don't think there's a broad awareness of some of this stuff. And I think coming back to diet culture, I think a lot of people kind of think that certain styles of restrictive eating are actually very normal.
Or an asset.
Yeah, yes, exactly, or something to be revered. So I think there are lots of people who maybe in their heart of hearts are like, oh, something isn't quite right here, but probably wouldn't think that they have an eating disorder because of the incorrect stereotype.
Yeah, so
I was sitting in the hospital for about 2 weeks, convinced I had diabetes because I had no idea of the level of restriction that I was undergoing, and the denial was just so thick, I couldn't cut my way through.
Yeah.
So what did realizing that you were in denial about it look like for you?
It was a lot of tough discussions. It was a lot of stereotype destroying. So I had to learn that no, you don't have to be underweight to be experiencing these things. You don't have to be just incredibly vain, and in fact, it's probably better if you're not. And
it's definitely not a vanity illness, that's for sure.
Right. And I remember one young doctor in particular, she listed off all these symptoms as if she knew what was going on, and I just looked at her and I went, "You've read my mind," and she goes, "No, I've lived it." And that was, I think, a very powerful moment for me to think, oh, other people have done this, and it's not just me, and it's not me that's the problem, it's the eating disorder that's the monster.
Yeah.
It was rough.
Yeah, and that speaks to the power and the value of having somebody with lived experience.
Precisely, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and I imagine that's what your clients or patients or whatever term you use, I don't know, Megan, but I imagine they get that out of you as well, that you can speak to your lived experience as well as your professional expertise, I suppose.
Yeah, because I think, one of the messages that's unfortunately still out there in the eating disorder space is that you manage this for the rest of your life, which is not true. People go on to make full recoveries from their eating disorders all the time. So I think, yes, like I am open about my lived experience, but I think the other big part of it is just being a living human being that no longer has an eating disorder, but previously did, because I think, like a lot of people don't necessarily speak that openly about it because we were taught to feel shame about the experience. So I think, having more people saying that, yes, I live with this was my experience is helpful.
Breaking down the stigma
of
it and all of the layers and complexity to it. So to bring it back to fat phobia, I feel like that's such a big part of the social component to this issue. Like our perceptions of what eating disorders are is infused with fat phobia, as well as like generating some of the challenges because we want to be a certain type of person, because we have this image that comes from fat phobic sort of conceptions of people that are it's a systemic issue. So how do we address that?
Oh Lord. I think it has to be at every level. So I personally think the medical industry, the health professionals need better training. And the reason I would start with them is actually because health professionals and family are known to be the two biggest perpetrators of fat phobia. And health professionals are in positions of power. We go to health professionals to get help on really intimate things. And if our training is all through kind of a weight-centric lens, then that's the message that people are going to be getting from people in power. So I think, a lot of our kind of medical health research just needs to be aware of how this actually comes out in research and clinical practice. And then I think the other thing from there is, which is, exciting to see, I think a lot of people are kind of getting sick of dieting, and, body positivity or body neutrality are, gaining popularity. Like I certainly didn't see any celebrities that were killing it that looked like Lizzo when I was growing up. Like just people like that you're sort of seeing more and more of. So I think it has to happen at every level, like in the science, but then in culture as well.
Yes, yeah. And I think a lot of that resonates with me when I think about the things that we need to change in the healthcare system for neurodiverse people and the disability movement and what they're working towards in general. We need to think about people with a neurodiversity and disability differently. We need to bring that movement that comes from outside of the medical model into how people inside of the medical model, inside the healthcare system, address the issues that they face and frame the healthcare challenges that they have. It sounds like there's a lot of similarities to the work that needs to be done. We need to broaden what healthcare is and how we address these issues and conceptualize these problems. So
totally.
I'm loving it. I'm loving that there's movement in that space. It's going to grow. It's going to get better as long as we stick to it. And how we see bodily difference in the disability sector, and how we think of mental health, and how we use our bodies that comes from the disability sector and neurodiversity. I think that can lend something to the eating disorder world, and I'm sure that we can learn from the eating disorder world in how they've addressed body image and what a healthy body is. So yeah, there's so much that can be done in this space, but it's important to recognize that there's already so much going on and so much to look forward to. I want to ask you about, speaking of things to come, what your research is about.
Right. Yes. So yeah, my PhD is in something called interprofessional collaborative practice, which is basically just the fancy names for teams working very collaboratively in the eating disorder sector. And the reason I chose that as my topic is because I just firmly believe eating disorders are, far too complex and far too nuanced to be treated by, one specific discipline. We need those layers of care, but real problems arise when we work in teams that don't send consistent messages. And I see eating disorders thrive in those gaps and inconsistencies. So the PhD is looking at how we can particularly help dietitians, mental health professionals, and GPs provide more collaborative and cohesive eating disorder treatment.
Yeah, that's so important. The siloing that can tend to happen in different health professions, and people getting lost in the gaps, people not meeting the criteria to see the next person, and then not getting holistic and optimal treatment.
Yeah, and eating disorders, we talk about people with eating disorders being quite ambivalent, because there's part of you that wants to change, but then there's part of you that's terrified of change. So if your team is sending mixed messages, your eating disorder is kind of going to be like, you know what, we probably should stay the same because these people clearly do not know what they're on about. So it is actually just super helpful. And eating disorder treatment feels like super counterintuitive to the person going through it. It's like, eat more food, you will feel terrible. Gain more weight, you will feel terrible. We promise you it's the right thing to do. So by having multiple people on the same page saying the same thing can just make a hard thing a lot more achievable.
Yeah. Absolutely. I can imagine that having that sort of message being able to sink in, and having different approaches from different professions maybe sort of make you see that the framework that you need to work with a bit better. So I think that might be a good note to sort of maybe wrap this up. I want to ask you both, from your lived experience perspectives, getting that message that you need to do things that you really don't want to do, you need to eat more and gain weight, deal with that message. How did you I'll start with Jade. How did you manage to hear that and then come out the other side? How did you cope?
The short answer is I didn't.
Okay, well,
and it wasn't until I really didn't understand things. I knew that I had to do what these people said to continue living, because my current state was not sustainable. So I sort of just kept living by sheer force of will, until I started doing some obsessive compulsive disorder recovery and doing exposure therapy with that. And it's really started to click then, that doing things that you're afraid of makes them less scary. That sort of felt like it almost felt like stage one was food is scary, food is no longer scary. Step two, I'm a bad person, that's okay. If that makes sense.
I can understand a little bit about that, having OCD myself. I just swap food with other things, perhaps.
But just because my compulsions were food related doesn't mean that there's a massive crossover between OCD and neurodiversity and eating disorders.
And it sounds like that initial acute phase was just a very, you were in a very severe state and just had different goals. Like you just needed to survive. So it was going to be very different for you to transition from that to something that's a little bit more long-term focused, a little bit more stable, a little bit more broad and abstract, where you're conceptualizing.
And like Megan said, it just takes forever.
Yeah.
Therapy isn't a sexy thing.
It's I think it can be disheartening and disempowering to know that it's long term, but it can also be a good thing in terms of helping you get the right framework, and seeing yourself in a new way can be empowering, or at least I hope it can be. That's sort of sometimes how I feel about it.
To me, sometimes if I feel like I'm stagnating or life isn't going the way I think it should, I look back at the last 7 years of recovery and think maybe when I'm 70, I can still have another 7 years exactly like that and come out being like basically the Dalai Lama.
Yeah. So how did you deal with that, Megan, that hearing that you needed to eat more and gain weight and stuff? And
yeah, I think it came back to that notion of like creating a life that was worth living for. But I guess that reflection of like the goals my eating disorder had weren't compatible with other things I wanted for my life. So yes. I had to kind of recognize that like, eating disorders don't selectively numb. So while they may have numbed some of my pain and anxiety, they also numbed my joy and my spontaneity. And so, recognizing that in order to maintain this weight, shape, and size, or this control over my diet, I couldn't then have the freedom to travel or, be with my friends, or I wasn't as, spontaneous in day-to-day life. And so ultimately it was just about really, really accepting that the two were incompatible, because I think there's part of your brain that's like, oh no, I could totally make it work, it's fine. But if you kind of are really honest with yourself and accept that you just cannot have both, I think that helps change happen. The other thing I realized is I honestly thought that by me nourishing my body and being myself, that like everyone would just hate me and leave me. And by just doing the things, life was a corrective experience. And I realized just by doing the hard things, like you said, Jade, people didn't leave. In fact, my relationships actually got better. So sometimes doing the hard things, life then, offers you experiences that go against what your brain told you were going to happen.
Wow, that's an awesome and powerful thing to end on. So thank you so much, both of you, for being a part of this and sharing your lived experience. And I'll put your details, Megan, in the thing, if people want to reach out to you, if that's
more than welcome.
Good. And
yes, go for it.
Jade, you'll be back. People can always see you here. So
I'll be around.
Good.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you
both so much.
Very much.